It's one of my favorite themes in Sovereign Man to highlight the constant and ever-changing nature of wealth and power. We talk about this a lot. You can go back in time to the origins of human history, and we can see civilizations in ancient Mesopotamia that were, thousands and thousands of years ago, the center of wealth and power in the world. You can look at the ancient Egyptians. We can look at the great Persian Empire. We can look at the Macedonians and the Greeks. We can look at the Romans. One of the more famous examples of wealth and power essentially being concentrated in a single dominant superpower. That's the way of the world. There's always been a dominant superpower in the world, and that dominant superpower shifts from time to time. From the Romans, the Western Roman Empire fell, and they set up a new capital in Constantinople, which is the last time I spoke to you just a few days ago. We did a podcast from Constantinople, and I told you about an interesting experience I had. I went to go to a palace in Constantinople, in Istanbul now, obviously, and it was a palace that they built sort of at the tail end of the Ottoman Empire. There was a time that the Ottoman Empire was the dominant superpower in the world, and the Europeans were terrified of the Ottomans. They felt these men from the East were going to come and they're going to take over Europe, and they had a huge battle in Vienna, and forces from Poland and Lithuania had to come over and basically save all the Europeans' asses against the encroaching Ottoman Empire. Everybody was terrified of the Ottomans. They were the scariest, meanest guys, and everybody was just expected they were going to take over the world. The Ottoman Empire was the center of wealth and power in the world, and everybody knew it. And then they weren't. Then that wealth and power shifted through their own stupidity, their own financial folly, their idiotic policies and bureaucracy, and the Ottoman Empire faded away. I went to go see this big palace that was built in the late 1800s, sort of to try and show the world that, hey, we're wealthy too. We can, we still got it. And it was a titanic and colossal waste of money. It was a stupid thing to do. It would be, if Zimbabwe decided to go out and build a space station or something. I mean, it was like the entire world would be looking at that going, what's the point? Why would you do something that expensive and so colossally stupid? And that's basically what happened in the Ottoman Empire. They tried to build this big palace to show the world, yeah, we're still rich and powerful. No, you're not. You're broke. You're insolvent. It's a stupid thing to do, and everybody just thinks you're an idiot. And now here I am in Versailles. And you'd think by my travel schedule, I'm actually on this tour of, former dominant superpowers in the world, having gone from Istanbul now to Versailles. If you've never been, of course, Versailles is not too far from Paris. If you land at Charles de Gaulle Airport, it's 30 minutes maybe. It's a quick drive. And the only reason I'm here, I wouldn't come here of my own volition. Actually, I'm admittedly the world's worst tourist. I tend to do things kind of by the seat of my pants when it comes to travel. I like to get in a car. I don't have an itinerary when I travel, particularly if I'm trying to be on vacation or something like that. I like to just get in a car and go wherever the wind happens to take me. But in this case, I'm visiting with my parents, who randomly just decided to show up to France this summer, which is not something that my parents usually do. So I literally figured the least I could do is come out and meet my parents and hang out. And they really wanted to see Versailles. And so we came out here. And again, if you've not been, Versailles is the site of the Grand Palais, this enormous grounds, a series of palaces really that was built for one guy, for Louis XIV. We've all heard of Louis XIV, the famous Sun King. He was the epitome of absolutism. He, famously believed that every scrap of property within the domain of France at the time belonged to him personally. He was everything. Everything belonged to him. And you have to look at that. I find it positively revolting. I think, who the hell is this guy? Seriously. I mean, is just some guy who's born, he pops out of the birth canal, and they said, "You are the king." And he became king essentially when he was a baby, and lived his entire life, lived a very, very long life, and was king for his entire life, essentially bankrupting the country simply for his own personal benefit. It's disgusting. It's a disgusting system. And I think wealth and prestige and these things are absolutely fantastic when you earn it. And he didn't earn it. In fact, none of these people earned it. They were just part by complete accident of birth. They came into this world anointed with privilege and favor at the expense of everyone else. And you think about all the thousands and tens of thousands of people that slaved away for years and years building this palace, and all the people, the millions, tens of millions of people, who were subjects of a guy that, they never signed up to believe in. They never signed up to follow, and yet they had to do everything, and everything was done for the sake of one person in an entire country. It is absolutely insane. It's a disgusting system. And to me, the fact that, tourists still kind of come to a place like this and flock to Versailles to stand in line and go through. They actually have metal detectors here now. That's really revolting. As if a bunch of sexually frustrated teenagers from the Islamic State are going to show up and blow up Versailles. Honestly, it's the whole thing is ridiculous, and so we all stand in line here to look at a bunch of stuff. It's all reproduction furniture, so we can all be impressed by how luxuriously they all used to live hundreds of years ago. And I find it disgusting because when I look around and I see this great big beautiful place, and I think he didn't earn it. He didn't earn any of it. He didn't do anything for his entire life. He was born, and they said, oh, well, you're going to have this amazing life full of luxury and concubines and wealth and prestige and, this most comfortable, most incredible palace ever constructed and so forth. It's truly revolting. And it still stands to this day and one of the most popular tourist attractions in the world. And, because people think, oh, it's, the art and the architecture and so forth, and it's a monument to this, achievement. It's not. It's a monument to stupidity, because that's really what it is. France, for a time, was the dominant superpower in the world. Again, wealth and power shifting. It went from the Ottomans and then kind of moved to the Habsburgs and Spain. And they were heavily exploring, exploring the Indies, exploring South America. The Spanish had huge mines in Peru, sending back ships full of gold and silver and so forth. And for a time, the Spanish were essentially the dominant superpower in the world. And then that shifted to the French, really, with the Treaty of Westphalia at the end of the 30 Years' War. And the French now sort of became the dominant superpower. That happened to be exactly when Louis XIV was born and anointed and became the king of France. And for more than a century, France was really the dominant superpower in the world. And what was interesting was that this guy, this one person, essentially spent his entire life bankrupting his nation, building monument after monument and palace after palace, and it's disgusting. It's revolting. And it got to the point where, France was very clearly in that position. They were the dominant superpower. They had so much wealth and splendor. They weren't afraid to show it. They had, monument after monument. They had public hospitals, and they had this huge army that was constantly out there waging war, and they were, developing colonies, and they had all these things, all the trappings of success that any major empire throughout history has basically had. And all those things are really, really expensive. It was incredibly expensive to build this palace, all these grounds. I mean, if we were to do it in today's dollars, it would be it'd probably be a huge chunk of the budget just to even maintain a palace like this. It's absolutely incredible. And all these things slowly but surely began to bankrupt the nation. It got to the point where as the deficits kept piling up, what's interesting is that the French were meticulous record keepers, and for those of us who are financial wonks, I'm actually far more interested, rather than wandering around with a bunch of tourists taking photographs of architecture and things like that. I'm actually much more interested in reviewing all the documents, the chiffres, all the numbers and the statistics and the accountants and the books that they kept. And you can actually see in the old days, of this kingdom, in which the Bourbon monarchy would keep great records and show how much all the deficit that they were racking up, all the essentially they just didn't collect enough tax revenue, and yet they spent lavishly on everything. It was like drunken sailors going out. They just blew all their money, and they went on when they couldn't cover it, they just borrowed. They went into debt, like essentially every dominant superpower does. They say, hey, we're the dominant superpower. It's a privilege for people to loan us money. People want to loan us money because we're the dominant superpower. So they go out and they do this sort of thing. And they started racking up debt. And that debt became bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger until they had to borrow money just to pay interest on the money that they had already borrowed. They had to go into further debt just to pay interest. And that was truly the point of no return. It was interesting because after Louis XIV died, now we're in the 1700s, Louis XV is now in power. And they got to the certain point where Louis XV knew, in fact, everybody knew in government, they said, this is unsustainable. We have to do something. And Louis XV called his council together and said, we have to cut costs. We have to find a way to cut our expenses and start living within our means. And everybody looked at, at all their various departments and all these programs and so forth. And they had their monuments and their army and their public health care and all these things. And they said, well, we can't do away with any of this stuff. Because the French people had it all for so long. They'd had their free public health care. They'd had their hospitals and they'd had their arts and all these things. And they'd had it all for so long. It no longer felt like privileges. It felt like rights. It felt like, these are institutions. You can't do away with these things anymore because we're so used to them now. They've become ingrained in French culture. Now everything is critical. It's urgent. We have to have all of these things, and we can't find any way to cut. And so the apparatus just got bigger, and they went deeper and deeper and deeper into debt. And debt kills. It is an absolute killer. When people get too far into debt, it creates problems. Sometimes debt, a little bit of debt can be a very sharp thing to do. Taking on a little bit of debt can boost investment returns. Judicious and intelligent use of debt can actually be a really, really good thing. Real estate investors do this a lot. They take on debt. A lot of investors take on debt in judicious, prudent amounts. But when you go and you take on a lot of debt to finance consumption, to finance free stuff that doesn't have really any investment return whatsoever, it's foolish and it's destructive. It's the equivalent of racking up huge amounts of credit card debt to go buy, TVs and a new entertainment system. It just doesn't make any sense. There's no investment return there. It's destructive. All you're doing is borrowing from future prosperity. There's a huge difference. And this is what governments tend to do. Particularly when they're the dominant superpower, because they feel like the laws of the financial universe simply don't apply to them. And there's really just one universal law of prosperity. It's very simple. You have to produce more than you consume. And whether it's individuals or companies or nations and governments, anybody who produces more than they consume is going to be okay. If you consume more than you produce, you're not going to be okay. You can kick the can down the road for a while, but eventually it's going to come back and get you. And that's exactly what happened in the case of France. And so as they continue down this ridiculously unsustainable path of borrowing and borrowing and borrowing, where they're spending, 10, 20, 30% of their tax revenue just to pay interest on the debt, having to borrow money just to pay interest on the debt, it got so unsustainable and the economy drastically weakened as a result. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that when you're in debt way beyond your eyeballs, it's going to have a serious effect on your economy. The economy in France weakened. It got to the point where it was decreasing their agricultural capacity. Everything declined, and this is where you start getting economic problems. And one of the things that I'll always like to point out to people, one of the great rules that we see, the great lessons from history, is that people will really put up with a lot. They'll put up with inflation, and they'll put up with even, reducing their rights, reducing their freedoms, and they'll put up with idiot leadership and stupid kings and politicians. But as soon as you start making it a problem for them to put food on the table for their families, that's the stuff that revolutions are made of. And that's, of course, exactly what happened in France. They had a really bad winter in 1788. A lot of people were starving. They didn't have enough food stores to tide people over. The politicians in charge, people were completely out of touch, and of course it finally came to a head in 1789. Now, the kind of in history books we're taught that, that the French Revolution started on July 14th, 1789, that all these people just marched down and stormed the Bastille, and that was the start of the revolution. That's not really the case. It's a convenient date that we can point to and say that was the start of the revolution, but really these problems had been going on for years. It's not like that was the very first riot there ever was or the very first protest or anything like that. These things have been going on for a really long time. It just happened on July 14th, 1789. They marched down the street and they took over the Bastille. It wasn't even really a huge fight. One of the best eyewitness accounts, actually, of the storming of the Bastille was actually Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson was living in France at the time. He wrote about it extensively in his diaries. It's a very interesting eyewitness account, talking about, he's looking out his window and all these angry French peasants are marching down the street towards this little fort that was poorly guarded. There weren't really a lot of people there because, of course, the government at that point was so broke they couldn't afford to keep a lot of people guarding the Bastille and so forth. So it wasn't really a huge thing, but nevertheless, that's the date that is kind of generally agreed on. And in time, they went and basically just took over the government. Now, here's where it gets interesting, is because people often think that when you have a revolution that everything's going to change and it's all going to be good. And we can even see that in our own time. Remember a couple of years ago when we had the great Arab Spring, and and these people rose up in Tunisia and Egypt and all these places, and everybody thought, yeah, the good times are going to be here now. And what happened? Nothing. They ended up basically right back where they started. In Egypt, they traded one dictator for another, and then that dictator for yet another. They just kept swapping out dictatorships. Of course, that's the definition, really, of revolution. If you look at the definition of revolution from a celestial perspective, revolution is really one complete turn around an axis, just like the earth revolves around the sun. And when you complete a revolution, where are you? You're right back where you started. That's what happened in Egypt. And that's what happened in France. In 1789, when they started this, quote, revolution, suddenly now the people were in charge, right? And they had a National Assembly, and the National Assembly got together and said, okay, great, now we're in charge. But guess what? All the problems were still there. Just because, the king was supposedly no longer in power, now it was Louis XVI who was the king, and his wife Marie Antoinette. Now, suddenly the king's no longer in power, and you have this National Assembly that supposedly is from the people and all these things. And yet they still have the same problems. They still have this massive debt. They still have this huge budget deficit. They're not taking in enough money. How are they going to solve this problem? And the National Assembly was beside itself trying to come up with a solution. What are they going to do to solve this problem? Because just having a revolution doesn't fix your economy. It doesn't make the debt go away. So what do? They decided to print money. They went to the old playbook, something that's happened so many times before. We can go back to the stories, the travels of Marco Polo. And Marco Polo comes into China and sees all these people passing around paper currency. He said, I couldn't believe what I was seeing. These people passing around paper, pretending like it actually had real value. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. And of course, that system collapsed. Every time people tried a system of paper currency, it collapsed. The French themselves had tried a system of paper currency. John Law, the Scotsman, the murderous Scotsman, who ended up in France and became good friends with the Duke of Orleans and created this sort of paper currency system in France. It was one of the greatest financial bubbles in history, which we'll have to do a whole separate podcast just to talk about John Law. It's an incredible story. And it caused a massive collapse in the French financial system and huge problems, huge bailouts in the French economy and so forth, all because of this paper currency. And what was so interesting is this was about maybe 70 years later. And, there were people in France at the time, and now we're in 1789, 1790, and there were people in this National Assembly who remembered the time of John Law, and they said, yeah, we've tried paper currency before and it didn't work, but you know what? This time is different. Those words, some of the most dangerous words you can ever hear, particularly when they apply to finance. This time is different. We've learned our lessons, and now we're going to do it different. We're smarter than they were 70 years ago. We're better than we were 70 years ago. Everything is different now. And so they tried it. And this time, their paper currency system was a rather interesting one. They decided that they would back it all up with land. They needed assets. They needed a whole bunch of assets in order to back up this paper currency. And so in order to come up with the assets, they confiscated it. They actually went to the church and said, hey, I understand you've been accumulating a huge portfolio of land for the last 1,500 years. We'd like to take that land now. Thanks very much. So they took all of this land from the church, which you can imagine didn't make the church particularly happy. In fact, there were a bunch of priests who went around and said, anybody that uses this paper currency will be damned to hell until the end of time. So the priests really, the church itself really did quite a propaganda job trying to prevent people from using paper currency. But this is actually the first lesson. I want to talk about 3 lessons here in France's second major experiment with paper currency. And the first of these lessons is that people were begging for it. In fact, when the proposal was made, it was cheered. People were desperate. They said, paper currency, that will be our salvation. We'll create money and it'll be great. And everybody was just begging for it. In fact, there was a huge uproar because when they first created the paper currency, they created, I believe it was 400 million units, which at the time was an astounding sum of money. It was astounding. Today we deal in trillions. It's a billion, 10 billion. That's like nothing today, right? That level. You couldn't even use the word billion back then. You might as well have said a gajillion because it didn't even exist. People couldn't even conceptualize. A million was an enormous amount. 400 million was just unheard of. They printed 400 million units, and there were people that were so bitterly angry about it because they thought they didn't print enough. They wanted more. And yet the government stood by and said, now, this is all we're going to print. 400 million. That's all it's ever going to be, ever. And of course, fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. It was about 6 months they had blown through the entire 400 million. They said, well, we're going to print a little bit more. And the next issuance was even more. And they did another one, and 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 they kept creating more money, more units. They ended up with different kinds. They had assignats, and they had mandats, and they had all kinds of different units. They had to press an entire army of people into service, workmen who worked from 6 a.m. until 8 p.m., doing nothing but just printing this paper money all day long. In fact, the printing guys were so overworked, they went on strike. They said, we're working too hard for too little money, printing all this money. We just can't do it anymore. And by December 1792, this was a little, just maybe 2.5 years from the very first one. I think the first one came out in April 1790. Now, December 1792, in 2.5 years, they went from 0 to 400 million, and from 400 million to 35 billion units in 2.5 years. That's almost 100 times more than what they had originally said. 100 times more. They said the very first time, this is all we're ever going to do. And then in 2.5 years, they'd done 100 times that money because they got addicted to it. Because everybody got addicted to it. It was so easy. All you had to do was just print more money. You printed money, you put it out there in the system, you bought whatever you needed to, you paid down these debts and so forth. And yet everybody was asking for it. People cheered the policy of their own demise. The first time they were angry because they didn't print enough money. The second time they were angry because they didn't print enough money. They asked for more and more. In fact, there are some people that were really smart about it. The people that were really smart said, hey, wait a minute, they're just creating money out of thin air. I should short the money and go long real stuff. In other words, I should use the paper and buy real things that can't be created. So people went out and they bought property, and they bought gold, and they bought essentially real assets. They bought productive assets. That was the solution. And those people did extraordinarily well. There are a lot of people who even took a little bit greater risk. And just what we talked about earlier, they went into debt. Because they said, I know what's going to happen here. I'm going to be able to pay off this debt in a couple of years with pocket change. And that's exactly what they did. You go out and borrow $1 million, and in 2 years, $1 million was worth nothing. You could pay off $1 million with your pocket change. And so they went out and basically borrowed all this money and just ended up getting a bunch of free stuff out of it. They bought real things that couldn't be conjured out of thin air by politicians and bankers. And those guys did they did incredibly well. Meanwhile, everybody else, they thought it was a great idea. They thought it was going to be a fix to all the problems. They thought it would pay off the debt. They thought it would boost the economy. In fact, for a while, it was working. And people thought, hey, you know what? I think my property value's gone up. I think I feel wealthier. People actually felt like they were wealthier. And they thought the reason for that was because they're printing money. So if I'm feeling wealthier because we printed money, let's print more. Why fix what ain't broke? Let's keep printing and printing and printing. And of course, what ended up happening was they ended up getting inflation. Not right away, but in time, they started getting a little bit at first, and then a massive amount of inflation. You start looking at the prices of bread and sugar and coffee and rice and so forth. It was absolutely incredible. We start seeing some of these things where I was looking at the price of let me see, it was one of the flowers. Great example. Went from 2 francs in 1790 to 225 in 1795. Over 100 times, more expensive. I mean, can you imagine something that you're paying for right now in the span of a couple of years being 100 times more expensive? But at the beginning, it was great, right? Because everybody felt wealthier. That's one of the great hallmarks of inflation, is that in the beginning, you don't get this retail price inflation right away. You get asset price inflation. You get, the value of stocks goes up. The value of property goes up. The value of stuff goes up. Then you start getting, retail price inflation. Sugar, wheat, rice, bread, all these things, everything got more expensive. You know what didn't get more expensive? Wages. Wages didn't go up at all. Everything got enormously inflated except for the wages of labor. And so people of means, people of intellect, had enough foresight to try and put as much of their wealth, as much of their property into objects of permanent value. People in the working class didn't have that kind of foresight. They didn't have the skills. They didn't have the financial acumen. And so it was essentially onto the shoulders of the poor, and the working class was the great crushing weight of financial loss. And after it happened, you start getting the same stories over and over again from these sorts of episodes. You start seeing dilapidation of infrastructure. You start seeing businesses go under. You start seeing people starving. And of course, the government ended up stepping in and saying, you know what we're going to do? We're going to start controlling these things. Every time it gets out of hand, governments step in and think that they can control all the variables in the system. It's like a massive factory with a zillion levers, and you got a handful of guys that think that they can properly, pull all the different levers and not make any mistakes. It's absolutely absurd. And so they got their Venezuela on, they got their Argentina on, and they imposed price controls. And they had strict price controls to the point that there were severe penalties for anybody that was violating the price controls. They had also capital controls, where they said if you've got precious metals, if you've got gold and silver, they have to be bought and sold at the official, paper currency rate, not the black market rate, that was way higher, but at the official rate, because they're printing so much money, the paper currency became utterly worthless. And then people said, you know what, I only want to deal with gold and silver now. I only want to deal with something real. I only want to deal with precious metals. And of course, that became outlawed. That became illegal. That's a form of capital controls. When you take, when you essentially take real money and you make it illegal, when you outlaw the use of real money and you force people into this system. So they had wage and price controls. They had capital controls, and they had severe penalties. Where selling gold and silver at an exchange rate that wasn't the official government rate would get you 6 years in shackles. And then they escalated that because it wasn't a deterrent enough. So they increased it to the death penalty. And it was the same thing. You would incur a death penalty simply for having asked if you could close a transaction in another currency other than the official paper currency. They even threatened people with a death penalty for making an investment outside of France. If you went outside of France and invested your money elsewhere, you would be threatened with the death penalty. They threw around the death penalty like it was a slap on the wrist. Everything came with the death penalty. Death penalty, for publicly condemning the paper money system. If you said a bad word about the government, if you said a bad word about the paper currency, if you influenced other people to think poorly about the paper currency, you go to jail for months, years, or even be sentenced to death. And that's really kind of the second lesson behind all this. The first one is that people will always ask for the thing that causes their own decline. And the second is that even despite all this central planning, even despite all these penalties, under penalty of death, they still couldn't succeed. Even with all of these, contrivances, even with every policy they could come up with to make it succeed, to make a paper currency system succeed, they still failed because it's just not possible. There's no example that anybody can point to in all of human history in which it works. And as it starts to decline, as it inevitably does, any paper system always goes into decline. Any highly centralized system always goes into decline. And when it does, their response is to try and centralize it even more. We start controlling things. We start controlling prices. We start controlling the free flow of capital. We start controlling what people can and cannot do with their own money. We start controlling the media. We start controlling people. You start controlling information. This is the same sort of thing we see today. We see these countries, these economies, these financial systems in decline, and it's the same sort of stuff we see today. And the point is, France shows us that even with all of that, even when you threaten people, every last little tiny transgression, you threaten people with death, and you can control the information, and you can control the media, you control all these things, because they didn't have the internet back then. They couldn't just go tweet whatever was on their mind. It was everything that could be much more tightly controlled, and even then, they still failed. They couldn't save it, because nature is too powerful of a force. But the other interesting thing about it, and the third lesson, the third thing I really want to highlight here, is that nothing goes up or down in a straight line. And even though they printed tens of billions of currency units, which again was just you couldn't even imagine a number like that. You could not even begin to imagine a number like that, in the 1790s. People's brains just didn't function with numbers like billions. They didn't even have that. You see it actually in old text. They wouldn't even call it 35 billion. They'd say 35,000 million. Because they couldn't even imagine a number. Why would you even have a term for a number that has 12 or what is it, 9 zeros after it? Who would even come up with something so ridiculous as a with a term? It's like us, like we don't have a term for a number with 7,000 zeros after it. We can't even imagine that kind of number, and yet there's going to be some point in the future where that exists. And people just kind of throw that number around in everyday conversation, just like we throw around billion and trillion and quadrillion and so forth. Now, this paper currency that they had, this was something that clearly the long-term trend was down. It was going to get weaker, and eventually it collapsed, just like every paper currency experiment that had ever existed before. Before the French tried it in the 1790s, always collapsed. And yet it didn't go up or down in a straight line. There were periods of strength, sometimes a lot of strength. There were periods of time, for example, when the French would, the French army was constantly at war. And it was funny because as they continued to print money, remember that they initially printed about 400 million currency units. And based on the land that they confiscated, they figured there was about 1 billion currency units worth of land. And so they had a really good backing. They said, well, we got 1 billion units of land and only 400 million units in circulation. So, this is a really good system for us. And when they printed a little bit more, they said, yeah, it's fine. We still have enough backing. And they printed more, and they printed more, and they printed more. And pretty soon, there was way more money in circulation than they had assets to back it up. They'd run out of land. So what did they do? They started confiscating land. They started confiscating the land of any Frenchman who had left, anybody that they didn't like. They just started taking people's property and putting into this big, national kitty so that, now we've got more assets to back up our currency units. And yet, they kept printing more and more and more and more. And then what did they do? Now they've got way more money in circulation than they have assets backing it up. So what do? They just started making it up. They just made shit up. They went out to their balance sheet. They said, well, let's see. We're currently at war, and so we know we're going to emerge victorious. We're certain that we're going to win these wars, and so just as soon as we win these wars, we're going to go and stick it to the Austrians, and the Austrians are going to pay us basically war reparation payments. So what they did? They ended up they actually issued an official government report talking about how because they knew they were going to win the war, they knew they were going to stick it to their enemies and that their enemies were going to pay them big reparation payments. So they actually included on their balance sheet reparation payments that hadn't been earned yet, future indemnification payments from war that they hadn't even earned. The war was still raging. The war was still going on. They hadn't fought the last battle. These things were still going on, and they said, well, we know we're going to win, so we're just going to go ahead and include that on our balance sheet. Money that they hadn't even earned from wars that they hadn't won, they were including as an asset on their balance sheet. It's like, it'd be like any of us saying, well, I feel like I'm going to make $100 million, 4 years from now. So I'm just going to put that on my balance sheet today. And I'm going to go to a bank and I'm going to try and get a loan, putting that on my personal financial statement. I'm just going to insert $100 million because that's what I think I'm going to earn, in the next couple of years. I mean, that's all fine and good, but if there's no basis for it, it's just a lie. It's just fraud. And of course, anybody that would actually do that would go to jail. It's fraud, plain and simple. But that's the sort of thing they would do. They would just lie. They would just make stuff up. They would confiscate people's properties. This is the sort of stuff that bankrupt countries do. And so they did it. This is what they did over and over again. And yet there were periods of time, because the currency didn't just go straight down. It didn't just collapse. Even with all this printing and printing and printing, there were still times when it would go up in value. For example, if the government went on this big propaganda campaign, the currency would go up in value. There was a period of time when maybe occasionally they would win some military victory, and the currency would go up in value. For example, if there was success of the French army against its foreign invaders, there's one instance in 1792 when it caused an appreciation in the value of the currency of over 20%. And then eventually this kind of irrational exuberance wore off, and they kept printing and printing and printing, and then the currency sank by 50%. But then they went on a really hardcore marketing campaign, pushing people to keep using the currency. They set up an elaborate spy network where you could rat out your neighbor in exchange for a cut of the proceeds and so forth. And then the currency rose by 60%. So it was up by 20, down by 50, up by 60. It kept seesawing, teetering back and forth. Up, it's down, it's up, it's down. Nothing goes up or down in a straight line. So there are periods, even when something as ludicrous as this, where they're printing 35 billion currency units, they have nothing to back it up. It's lies, it's deceit, it's capital controls, it's price controls, it's media controls and information controls and border controls and spy networks to rat out your neighbor. There were still periods of time that the currency went up, that it was strong. And people said, you see, it's strong. It's okay. We should keep printing more money because it's strong. And of course, it was a stupid thing to say because it eventually collapsed, just like they always do. But there's always periods of time when these currencies go up in value. Nothing goes up or down in a straight line. And if you look at these lessons, it's exactly the same thing today. We have, lesson 1, people always ask for it. We have some of the greatest financial luminaries in our modern time, people that we award our most esteemed prizes for intellectual achievement, who tell us that we should be printing more money. Paul Krugman went out and said, the problem with the Fed is that they haven't printed enough money. Never mind that they expanded their balance sheet from $850 billion to $4.5 trillion in a couple of years. Here's this guy who's won the Nobel Prize saying they haven't printed enough money. That's my beef. They haven't printed enough money. They haven't gone into enough debt. They're too worried about going into debt. They're too worried about deficits. These guys, need to stop with their candy assing around and just keep printing more money. And that's going to be the fix for everything. People beg for this stuff. You've got an entire industry in Wall Street now, and the entire financial sector that's just begging for cheaper and cheaper money. It's begging for zero interest rates. It's begging for more quantitative easing because they benefit from it, because their bonuses go up, because the asset prices go up. And what do they care? It's not their money. It's other people's money. Seriously, what do they care? They're managing other people's money. It could go up, it could go down. They get their bonus. They're happy. And the only thing that matters is, as long as they keep printing money, that they're going to make that bonus. There's an entire cult of people that's just begging for this stuff. And of course, the average guy doesn't have a clue how central banking works. Nobody really gets it. I think deep down, honestly, a child can understand it. It doesn't make sense. You don't just create money out of thin air. It doesn't make any sense. Even a kid can get it. But because central banking is complicated and you have these intellectual people say, you little people, you just don't understand. And so just leave the deep thinking to us. We know what we're doing and we're just supposed to trust them to be good guys. And I'm sorry, but that just doesn't work, particularly when every single action that they've taken, it's not like they've got a track record of being smart, financial, responsible stewards of other people's money. It's not like the banking sector has a track record of acting with integrity. Hardly a month goes by without some bank getting brought up on criminal charges. There's no integrity in this sector. And so to just trust that everybody's going to be a good guy is completely ludicrous. And yet they've sort of conned everybody into asking, please print more money. We need more money. And that's what it is. And people have been begging for this, and they always beg for what's going to cause their own demise. And number two, again, with all this central planning, this is what we have today. We see the early stages of capital controls in many respects. We see, all the different financial reporting and offshore disclosures we see are very early stage capital controls. We see in a lot of places, we see, here in Europe, we see bank withdrawal controls. We see controls on cash. It's practically only terrorists have cash now. I'm walking around. I've got a whole bunch of 500 euro notes that we withdrew from our bank for our foundation in Lithuania, so that we could make payments for things, because a lot of people like to take cash. And it's crazy walking around with this stuff. I'm like sweating it every time I cross a border now, because everybody wants to know. You cross a border, the only thing anybody wants to know is how much cash do you have. It's unbelievable. They've sort of criminalized this. They've created restrictions on how much money you can withdraw, your own money that you can withdraw from your bank account. All these things are different types of controls. They try and control all sorts of things. Again, hardly a month goes by without some kind of internet control, some legislation getting put forward to give them a kill switch over the internet or over some telecommunications and so forth. And of course, they're completely. This new revelation about AT&T. Wow, what a surprise! Being in bed with the National Security Agency. National Security Agencies out there, tapping that over and over and over again. No big surprise here. These are all different types of controls. They're information controls. They're people controls. They're capital controls. They're all these different types of controls. We see this over and over again. And as the financial system becomes weaker and more precarious, they roll out more and more of these things. And yet the French lesson shows us that even with all this central planning, even with all these centralized controls, they still can't save it. When you violate the universal law of prosperity and you consume more than you produce, you're in for trouble. That's it, and there's nothing that's going to stop it. It eventually catches up with you. But the third thing that we see is that, yes, even an infinitely conjured paper currency, sometimes it goes up. Sometimes there are periods of strength. And of course, that's what we're seeing right now. And people look at these periods of strength and go, you see, everything's fine. There's no consequences in printing money. Of course there are consequences in printing money, but nothing goes up or down in a straight line. There are consequences to conjuring money out of thin air. There are consequences to having to borrow your way out of debt, having to borrow money just to pay interest on the money you've already borrowed. There's consequences to consuming more than you produce, but nothing goes up or down in a straight line, and these are all very long-term challenges. The solutions to all these are quite simple, and they're the exact same solutions that they were 300, 400 years ago. Back then, when people saw the writing on the wall, what did they do? They took the paper and they traded it for stuff. Simple as that. They bought productive assets, they bought real assets, they bought assets of permanent value in exchange for the paper that was being conjured in infinite quantities. It was a simple solution. It worked then. It works now. And I'm here to tell you it's actually much, much easier now than it ever was back then. Back then they said, well, it's the death penalty and this, that, and the other, all these things. It's so much easier to do anything now. Now we can make investments overseas, with a click of a button. Our chief investment strategist, Tim Stermos, he likes to make a lot of recommendations. If you're a premium member, watch out for this shortly. Like these companies in Australia right now that are trading for less than the value of cash that they have in a bank. Those are good deals. In fact, Tim's average recommendation is up 57%. Over the last year or so. These are great investments. These are investments that are taking place outside of the home country of most people. You can do these sorts of things. You can buy property overseas. You can buy different assets all over the world now. In many cases, with a click of a mouse button, you can set up an international brokerage account and buy all kinds of different assets across the planet. Now, again, with the click of a mouse button, it's so easy. It's so much easier than it's ever been because of the technology that we have available. We can get on a plane and we can go buy, real estate abroad. We can go to places I was actually looking at some flats in Paris. We're just buying a new apartment in Santiago. In Paris, the prices are like 20,000 euros per square meter. That's over 10 times more expensive than they are in Santiago, Chile. I would argue that they're both very nice cities. You could probably edge out Paris and say Paris is a nicer city. 10 times as nice? I certainly don't think so. So there's a lot of really interesting pockets of value. Different places in Colombia, Medellin, Colombia. You can still buy property for less than $1,000 a square meter. It's not even the price of construction. You couldn't build it for that much. You can buy it for less than the price of the construction. That's a really good deal. And you can do that. You can go out and buy property for less than the cost of construction in a different jurisdiction, in a different currency. It's not in something that actually has real productive value. It's hard to imagine that it's going to be worse off for that. It's hard to imagine that somebody is going to be in a worse position because they have some paper currency that they've traded for something of real value, something that they bought for, let's say, a property that they bought for less than the cost of construction, that has the added benefit of not only providing income, because of course you can rent that out, but if you ever need it, you have a roof over your head. How are you worse off for that? Or buying, buying shares of a profitable company for less than the amount of cash that it has in the bank. Or all kinds of things like that you can actually take, paper currency when it's right now, essentially, the dollar is so strong right now. It hasn't been this strong in, more than a decade. And it makes all the sense in the world. Any rational investor knows that you sell what's expensive and you buy what's cheap. The dollar right now is incredibly expensive, and there are different assets around the world that are incredibly cheap. This is what intelligent people do. If you have a long-term view, you sell what's expensive and you buy what's cheap. This is the opportunity that we have right now, and it's an incredible opportunity. It's also an opportunity to take what's expensive and move it to different places around the world where you don't get pressed into capital controls and exchange controls and price controls and all these sorts of things, because you take your capital and you move it abroad. It's so much easier to do that now. You can set up accounts overseas and move money abroad with a phone call. With a phone call. In some cases, you might actually have to, I have to get on a plane and go to Hong Kong. What a burden. It's actually a very nice place to have to go and visit, particularly to open up a bank account in a place that's got one of the best banking systems on the planet. I mean, there's so many options out there to ensure that your savings isn't trapped in a system that's, where a handful of unelected central bankers are conjuring infinite quantities of money out of thin air at a rate that has never been seen before in the course of human history, and we just expect that everything's going to be okay. Well, there's never been an example of that ever in history, that everything's going to be okay. And maybe, the entire course of human history is wrong. Maybe history is so wrong, and maybe it does end up okay. Maybe benevolent space aliens show up tomorrow and they eliminate all the debt and they give us free energy and perpetual motion machines and all these things, and the unicorns come out and everything's fine. But even still, it's hard to imagine that you're going to be worse off because you bought a company for less than the value of cash that it has in the bank, or a property for less than the cost of construction, or moved at least a portion of your savings to a bank overseas that's literally 10 times more capitalized than the insolvent banking system where your money is currently trapped. It's hard to imagine that you're worse off for doing those things. And of course, if history is right, then those might be some of the smartest steps that you could have ever taken. I'm going to go ahead and cut it off there. I need to actually get back to this. I got people that I need to spend some time with now. So I really appreciate everybody's time and attention, and we'll talk to you again soon.